What if the solution to a desert kingdom's water crisis wasn't buried underground, but floating 6,000 miles away, in Antarctica? In 1977, a Saudi prince looked at a 100-million-ton block of ice, and decided the answer was to drag it across the equator to his own coastline. This isn't a movie plot. It actually happened. By the 1970s, Saudi Arabia had a problem that all its oil money couldn't fix. The kingdom was sitting on some of the largest oil reserves on the planet, but almost no fresh water. Rivers didn't exist. Rainfall was rare. And the population was growing fast. The obvious answer was desalination, stripping the salt out of seawater. Saudi Arabia was already building plants to do exactly that. But desalination is expensive, energy-hungry, and slow to scale. One member of the Saudi royal family thought there had to be a faster, cheaper way. His name was Prince Mohammed bin Faisal Al Saud, a nephew of the king, and the man already in charge of the country's desalination program. And in the mid-1970s, he became fixated on an idea that sounded almost too strange to be real. Here's the idea in its simplest form: Antarctica loses more freshwater ice every single year than the entire planet consumes. That ice breaks off as icebergs and just melts uselessly into the ocean. So why not catch one, and tow it to where the water is actually needed? The prince wasn't the first to think of this. An American oceanographer had proposed towing icebergs to California as early as 1949. By 1973, the RAND Corporation, the same think tank that advised the U.S. government on major strategic issues, had produced a 90-page feasibility study on towing a train of icebergs, each up to 600 meters wide, all the way to the California coast. But Prince Mohammed didn't just study the idea. He funded it. He founded a company called Iceberg Transport International, hired French engineers and a polar explorer, and announced a plan that sounded almost unbelievable: find a 100-million-ton iceberg in Antarctica, wrap it in plastic and sailcloth to slow the melting, and tow it, using tugboats, and in some versions of the plan, a floating nuclear-powered station to run the propellers, across the equator to the Red Sea coast. He publicly predicted the water would arrive within 3 to 5 years. To prove it wasn't a fantasy, the prince staged one of the strangest publicity stunts in engineering history. In 1977, his team shipped a small iceberg chunk, cut from Alaska, moved by helicopter, plane, and refrigerated truck, all the way to Iowa State University, landlocked in the middle of the United States. It was stored in a walk-in freezer until the big event, the first international conference on iceberg utilization, attended by roughly 200 scientists from 18 countries. At the conference, the mini iceberg wasn't just a demonstration piece. It was chipped into ice cubes, to chill the drinks of the very scientists debating whether the full-scale version could actually work. So if the science seemed plausible enough to fill a conference hall, why didn't it happen? The answer came down to one brutal detail of geography. 2 years earlier, in 1975, Saudi Arabia had already studied towing an iceberg specifically to the Red Sea coast. And they ran into a wall, literally, an underwater one. To reach the Red Sea, any iceberg would have to pass through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the narrow choke point between Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. In places, that strait is only about 70 meters deep. A 100-million-ton iceberg doesn't just float on the surface, most of its mass extends deep underwater. An iceberg large enough to matter would simply run aground before it ever reached the coastline it was meant to save. One American engineer put it bluntly to the prince at the Iowa conference: past a certain point, all he'd have left at the end of his tow rope was the rope itself. The geography problem wasn't the only issue. The cost was staggering, estimated at around $100 million for a single iceberg delivery, with no guarantee the ice would survive the journey through warm equatorial waters largely intact. While Prince Mohammed kept promoting the iceberg dream, higher-ranking members of the Saudi government quietly made a different decision. Instead of betting the kingdom's water supply on an untested, geographically impossible tow route, they poured their oil wealth into what actually worked: dozens of large-scale desalination plants. Boring. Reliable. Expensive, but proven. The Iceberg company faded. No berg was ever towed at real scale. Prince Mohammed bin Faisal died in 2017, and to his last days, a full-sized iceberg had still never made it to Arabian shores. 100-million-ton iceberg, wrapped in plastic, towed across the equator by a nuclear-powered tugboat, and it almost happened. If you think this is the strangest, nearly real project we've covered so far, wait until you see what's next. This is Unbuilt History. Subscribe, because the world's forgotten blueprints don't stop here.